My name's Corrine, and I am a criminologist. I have my master's degree in forensic psychology, my bachelor's degree in criminal justice, and a background in social work. I actually chose the path I did because I came into this world understanding why people do what they do, specifically why people respond and have trauma responses. So ultimately, if there's one thing, if I could sum it up, because it's a huge umbrella, that I understand. It's not just violence, victimization, and perpetration and what leads us there, both from an offender viewpoint and the victimology standpoint. It's trauma. And the way that the system perpetuates and pathologizes individuals in order to foster spaces for violence to happen and for individuals to take accountability when the system does not do the same thing. Okay. I had planned on going for my PsyD, so my doctorate in forensic psychology, where I would determine competency and criminal responsibility for high profile violence and offenders. However, I had a huge epiphany while I was at work because I've always worked in preventive and intervention care and more with youth and families that have not only significant histories of complex trauma, but are within state custody and usually have generational systemic involvement, right? I had this huge epiphany while I was at work that said, how are you going to determine competency under the law when the law doesn't take into account trauma? When I tell you that led me into a spiral, this was February of 2021. I went through all the options. I completely spiraled. What am I doing with my life? And I left my job in the field in October of 2021. And I've pivoted. I've done multiple different things, ultimately because the reality is, once again, we live in a society that not only loves to pathologize the individual, but loves to pathologize oppressed individuals.
Okay, so let's dive into this. So there's been some more recent developments that I've seen, and this is also part of why I take time to process and analyze because just because you have a theory doesn't mean that you should just abandon all outsources of information and act immediately upon that theory. And this is also a huge problem collectively, is that people get an idea in their head and they're unwilling to move from that idea. As a criminologist who's really based in the reality of humanity, I think it's extremely important to allow more information to come to me. Actually, like I mentioned, I have my background in forensic psychology. The forensic psychologist, Dr. Zazelle, said it perfectly, is that you don't go chasing evidence or fact. You don't go chasing fact. Fact comes to you as a forensic psychologist. And that's a really good way to understand the process. We need time to collect information, and especially in high profile cases, it's really important to make sure that any theory we are speculating on is based on the current facts that we are receiving now. So I did briefly see that there was a doctor, and ultimately that is what is being reported as why the trial closed early. And because, again, I'm not the judge, I'm not the prosecutor, I'm not the jury, I'm not the defense attorney. I really don't have any facts in regards to that. But I briefly checked into that and the validity seems there. And I don't want to argue that. But there's something larger at play going on. And I knew that, I have known that. But this really struck me ultimately on Tuesday, I believe it was, when Patrick Clancy's mother was called to the stand. If you all remember, the ADA said that you do know that murder is a moral sin, right? Instantly, when I tell you, my jaw dropped and I was like, what did she just say? So, in court proceedings, there's actually a lot of shady things that happen all the time. And this is part of why I'm making this video as well, because it's not clear cut like everyone wants it to be. Like, just write it down, just produce a theory. Blah. The court system is so nuanced because the reality is the court system consists of people, and people are nuanced. Power is nuanced. People, how they use their power is nuanced. It's not black and white. And this idea that it's black and white perpetuates across this idea that we live in this binary world: good, bad, right, wrong, evil. That does not exist. I, as a human, am nuanced and complex. You, as a human, are nuanced and complex. We, as human beings, are nuanced and complex. We come with our own individualized lived experience, which plays into our current reality and how we are in relationship to the world. There's so many different factors that go into making up us as a human being in this moment. And so when we're talking about the system, what people need to realize, the system is made up of people. So there's going to be so much nuance to it. There's going to be abuse of power. There's going to be confirmation bias. There's going to be corruption, right?
So, with all that being said, ultimately, something that is very true here, and what I hope you, at the end of the day, walk away from is that this is not simply about the Lindsey Clancy trial. I can't control or convince anyone of anything. What I can do is share facts and insights and a peek into the reality of the criminal legal system and the ways in which it plays out and looks like, and hopefully open your perspectives and minds into understanding what goes on for the greater benefit of yourself and the collective. Because at the end of the day, the system pathologizes individuals while evading its own accountability for failures to intervene. This is what I've said across the board, whether we're dealing with a high profile violent offender repeatedly throughout their timeline, because that's what I do is I go throughout the timeline of their life and I collect all of the information I can. I really like to be able to feel like I'm sitting right there and I've painted this image or created almost like the image turns into a video of what it could have looked like to be them. And what I continuously see is a failure to intervene. We could have intervened there. 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 But instead, we criminalized the 13-year-old and we called them a thief instead of asking why they're stealing food from a convenience store. Why would they possibly do that? So it's something much larger than just this one case. But in regards to this one case, I'm not surprised it's happening. This happens regularly. This is the reality of the mental health system. And this is why so many people are standing behind Lindsey Clancy, because we have been failed. We collectively have been failed. Mental health care, generally speaking, is not health care. We don't get best treatment. And that is the experience for so many people and for so many women, especially. Like, fun fact, most of the science we have today about our bodies is built off of men. Same with something like the DSM, the Diagnostic Statistics Manual. That is based off of what society deems abnormal in the moment. So, what social standards are deemed abnormal in the moment and what's considered normal. The 1950s and so on and so forth, being homosexual was in the DSM. And also, like, the people that determine what is abnormal historically and statistically are old white men. They are not representative of the people within our communities. Now, I've seen this a few times throughout the past few weeks, is to really pay attention to Latarsha Sanders. And I may be getting her name wrong, so I want to highlight that. Something I do not like is getting names wrong. So Latarsha Sanders, and this is going to tie in to the fact that mortal sin comment was made by the ADA. Now, this goes beyond freedom of speech. My jaw dropped, and I instantly was like, disbar, disbar, disbar. And one of my dogs just threw themselves out the door. Because this is separation of church and state. And that's significant. This isn't just some law or policy or freedom of speech. This is separation of church and state by an assistant district attorney prosecuting a high profile, high, just look at this case. Look at what's happening to the public. Public opinion is just shining through. And if you think for 2 seconds, public opinion does not matter, you are very wrong. So I'm going to give an example of just what politics actually look like when it comes to the criminal legal system. Politics are deeply embedded in the criminal legal system. In a perfect case, in cases, an example of this that I like to highlight are the O.J. Simpson case and the Menendez brother cases. So, quick little background, the Menendez brothers, the O.J. Simpson case, we know if it doesn't fit, you must acquit. There was a complete and total uproar. They were tried at around the same time by the same judge. And ultimately, there was a mistrial. And at the same time, O.J. Simpson, again, was prosecutor did not win the case, right? So the judge knew that the public was in an uproar and was facing a lot of heat, a lot of heat. And also, that same judge was up for re-election. So what happened? The mistrial happened, okay, with the Menendez brothers. And in the next court proceeding, the evidence brought forth, and that was going to be the judge pulled a few shady things, which again happens all the time because judges are allowed to. And there's a lot of bias that judges, there's certain roles like in the Commonwealth right now, in the Commonwealth of Massachusetts, that are interested in bringing trauma-informed care and teaching the neuroscience of trauma to players in the court system, which includes law enforcement, which includes judges, court officials, prosecutors, defense attorneys, so on and so forth. And they need it because there's this, ultimately the criminal justice system is based on these, what we call these two schools of thoughts, which are deeply rooted in classical and neoclassical criminological schools, right? Ultimately, these assert that humans are rational actors, free will to maximize personal pleasure and minimize pain. So, this perspective in itself, this rational choice theory that as human beings, we have this ability to be rational. And that's just not true. Because one of the core aspects of trauma is that when we experience a traumatic event, choice gets ripped from us, right? So how we navigate now is based on the fact that we just had a choice completely stripped from us in a really volatile, hostile, just completely So I consider trauma, like when a traumatic event happens to you, like it rips out a piece of your soul. So ultimately, the way a person who has a significant history of trauma, a significant history of complex trauma, interacts with the world around them is very different than how a person who has not experienced that traumatic event or those multiple traumatic events may operate. And what is traumatic to one person may not be traumatic to another person. That is all based upon our own lived experiences. And again, the intersection of our identities. This is where intersectionality is really important to understand. Because when you understand that our identities are so nuanced and so complex and so created by the way our okay, whatever. I'm going to go down a different rabbit hole and I need to stay focused. So that's another part of this is there's just so much. But again, the criminal justice system is deeply rooted in these schools of thought, and they are just so behind scientifically. If you think researchers and trauma specialists and neuroscientists aren't doing and have not been producing the research or all of the evidence throughout the years, you're highly mistaken. There are people in power that know this, and they know that implementing appropriate frameworks into the system to actually serve people won't benefit them because they thrive on proximity to power. So at the end of the day, a court case is a game. That's what it is. The prosecutors want to win, and I want people to focus on that. If justice actually meant something to the ADAs right now in the Lindsey Clancy trial, if the prosecutors actually cared about justice, they wouldn't be focusing on attacking just one single individual. They would be interested in understanding the ways in which the system failed continuously to intervene and to help this individual, because she's not the only individual this happens to. Right now, she's a representative of a collective experience. And that is why it's so important for us to understand that things like Tuesday are going to come with repercussions, and other cases that may seem, oh, yeah, that happened. Someone said this to me. Yeah, that came out. That was already determined during this case. Yeah, we already know about that. If you think that's not resonating in the background, again, you are highly. So, with the O.J. Simpson and the Menendez brothers cases, getting back to this, what ultimately happened is the judge knew, again, here's all this pressure. So, with the new trial, the judge attempted to remove Eric's attorney, Leslie, because the woman is a powerhouse and knows what she's talking about, was spot on. So between the times of the 1990s and a woman just completely destroying the courtroom, which is very patriarchal in nature, very much a man's world, for her to be showing up and showing out like that is a threat in itself, let alone the public opinion coming into play, let alone O.J. Simpson now walking free, people freaking out. LA in the 1990s was who when it comes to racial justice and systemic oppression. It was just right there in our faces. And they felt it and they knew it. So for the new trial, the judge attempted to knock down Leslie's salary, and basically the Menendez brothers and their family had drained all their money. And so she could be paid as a public defender, but he made it so she could only be paid like half the amount of being a public defender, which was like nothing. his hope was that she would back out and say, I literally cannot afford to do this. But she didn't. She took out a second mortgage on her house. So, shot number one. Okay. So, what did the judge do? He did not allow the evidence for the defense's case to come to trial because the judge can determine what type of evidence comes to trial. And if you think that they don't utilize this and people don't utilize it, and it's the justice system, they follow the law. It's a game. It's a game. It's a game. It's a game. That's why people are impressed with Reddington right now, because his ability to play this game is spectacular, as it should be. The ADA's piss poor. Terrible. Absolutely terrible. Terrible. So the evidence from the defense was the significant and horrendous amount of physical and sexual abuse that both those boys endured. And he didn't allow that. Also, something we're seeing right now is instructions for the jury. So I have spoken to one of the jury members who was referred to as one of Eric's girls by society, by people paying attention, mocked as one of Eric's girls. I have spoken to her in the past when I was doing an analysis of the Menendez brothers cases in grad school. And she, based on the instructions, right? We saw this with the Karen Reed trial, the ways in which the judge portrays instructions. So the judge can do it and make it purposely vague and not answer questions. And so a jury may think, oh, we're going to say this because this means that amount of time. So say, yes, they are guilty. We believe they should serve time. However, there's all these different factors and contributing factors that go into it. If we do X, Y, and Z based on the instructions, then they will only serve a certain amount of time, right? The instructions were not clear whatsoever. And based on the report and what this jury member has said to me, and this jury member has been active since the Menendez brothers case. So since the 1990s, speaking out and writing about this and addressing it and doing interviews on it has not changed their story and is not afraid to talk about it, which is incredible and shows the validity of what she's saying. The way they perceived what they were doing, if they said guilty, was portrayed completely differently. So ultimately, I don't remember the very specifics of the conversation, but I hope that makes sense. She thought if they did a guilty verdict based on and like the type of guilt, then yes, they would serve time and then they would get out, so on and so forth. It's not what happened. And they do this on purpose. So there was another aspect of it. So why does this all matter? I want you to pay attention. We're going to go back, okay? So again, on August 6th, 2026, the Latarsha Sanders case was confirmed and approved for a new trial. The parallels of this case are significant. The differences in the human beings of this case, which are factors, now that you've listened to me a little bit, that do go into play. And I want you to really understand the role they play. Latarsha Sanders was a Black woman, a Black mother of 4, and who 2 of her sons, super violent and tragic and awful and very evidently in active psychosis, just from the bare minimum 34-page document. So this is a download you can receive, and it's the Commonwealth versus Latarsha Sanders, March Sanders, and it's ultimately the reasons being why she should be granted a new trial. And the parallels of this case, again, are significant. So she was a Black mother of 4 children, lived in Brockton on a 3rd-floor apartment, which looks a lot different than Lindsey Clancy. As a criminologist, as a forensic practitioner, these are factors that you take into play. So the cases were tried before the current judge. I now have a theory that differs. We're not going to focus on just the simple aspect of, oh my God, court was cut short. Like a simple, again, I want to go back to Tuesday when that ADA, the mortal sin. So mortal gets brought up by this judge, the judge for the Lindsey Clancy case, and in this document by this judge during Latarsha Sanders' case. So if you think for 2 seconds that between public outcry, now there's a new trial for the Latarsha Sanders with similar parallels, very different outcomes. And again, there were games played, and I'll get into the games that were played by this judge and by the Commonwealth. And now people are going online, and the current attorney is speaking out publicly and doing interviews about the parallels and about the irony and the ways in which it failed and the reality of what Latarsha's case looked like versus Lindsay's case, which is significant. Things like this happening in Latarsha Sanders' case, seeing a new trial overlapping with this high profile case of Lindsey Clancy, because I know how the criminal legal system works. This is not just a coincidence. This is evidence of a pattern. And if I know anything, it's that the DA's office right now is scrambling. So the ADA and the DA's office do know right now how people feel about the Lindsey Clancy trial. And they know public opinion overall is in uproar, right? There is outrage, and that the public opinion is not on their side. I can tell this. One, they're either really incompetent, but two, you can tell in the way they're reaching and just absolutely flopping. Think of just the basic things that people are like making fun of for. This is so incompetent as someone that's supposed to be a prosecutor. Like it's gross. It's gross incompetent. And so they know they're flopping, right? And that moral sin moment comes down to a separation of church and state issue. When I was reading the Sanders appeal and the documents, at one point, the judge, so the current judge sitting for Lindsey Clancy and for that case back in time, discussed wrongfulness. So one of the arguments is that ultimately the prosecutor attempted in the closing arguments to spark emotion with the jury, which I am seeing continuously with the ADAs in different aspects, in the ways in which they're not being forthcoming about facts and they're ignoring facts, which is driving me nuts. And I can get into a separate aspect as well. But as a prosecutor, it is a law and a standard. It is a law and a standard that you cannot use certain language to or do certain things in your closing argument in an attempt to provoke an emotional response that would make the jury potentially lose sight or lose track of the facts and the evidence. In the closing argument, the prosecutor that tried Latarsha Sanders' case referred to Latarsha as evil. And this is mentioned in the document. One of the facts that Latarsha's team brings forward is in the closing argument, and this is on page 30. First, the defendant argues that the prosecutor committed profound and prejudicial misconduct by referring to her as evil throughout the closing argument. This perverse character attack, she maintains, was calculated to inflame the passions and prejudice of the jury. Ultimately, they cite and Let's see Commonwealth versus Santiago, 425, Mass 491, 501, 1997, SC 427, Mass 298 and 428, Mass 39, 1998. Appeals to sympathy obscure the clarity with which the jury would look at the evidence and encourage the jury to find guilt, even if the evidence does not reach the level of proof beyond reasonable doubt. Similarly, it is improper for a prosecutor to use insulting names designed to evoke an emotional rather than a rational response from the jurors. So, the prosecutor's use of the term evil premised on the defendant's own words written in her notebook and spoken in recorded telephone calls was permissible where related to the defendant's appreciation for the wrongfulness of her conduct, right? But referring to her as evil outside of that is prejudice. Okay. And this is where I think it's interesting. And this is where I know that this case is stewing for them in the background. The DA's office, I'm sure the judge, right? But right now I'm really focused on the DA's office. This is stewing. Again, someone mentioned, oh, that came up, whatever. It's just not let go. Okay. Between the public outcry, it's so similar to what's going on. They're facing backlash, negative public opinion. They're flopping. Things are not looking good for them. And now another case with parallels to determine competency with very evident psychosis, where the judge played a game and the Commonwealth fed into that game and she didn't get a fair trial based on the evidence that was admitted into court, just brought a new trial. So it's stewing. I believe first, so the judge instructed the jury that a person is not criminally responsible for her conduct if, as a result of mental disease or defect, she lacks substantial capacity either to appreciate the criminality or wrongfulness of her conduct or to conform her conduct to the requirements of the law. Wrongfulness, the judge further instructed, means the moral significance. Wrongfulness refers to moral import of conduct. In this limited fashion, the term evil was relevant to an issue raised in the case, right? An issue, but not a label signifying bad moral character. We trust that on retrial, the Commonwealth will use the term, if at all, in this context. So this is a word, and what I want people to understand is words hold significant weight when it comes to the criminal legal system, because words hold power. Words shape policy. They shape perspective. They cut into you. That's why you see these speakers. That's why things Reddington says in regards to this case, it gets under your skin. He knows what words to say. If words didn't hold weight, religion wouldn't exist. But the Bible has survived how many years? Words hold weight, words hold power, and people that work in this system know that. They know the significance of words. They determine who gets criminalized, who gets punished, who gets seen, who gets hurt, right? Think as simple as like good, bad, evil. So this moral being brought up and this moral sin happening on Tuesday, either she is so incompetent that this is being discussed in the background and they're stewing on it and it's coming out and she made a slip up type of thing, or because this is separation of church and state. Was she hoping for a mistrial? Was she hoping for a mistrial? Another part of this case that is significant, and I want to detail out to you so you understand the ways in which the court plays games, and it's a game of chess, like I've said. So the judge, the former judge in this case, ultimately restricted mental health and neuropsych evidence from a neuropsych doctor for Latarsha, who examined her. And ironically, this neuropsychologist was affiliated with McLean. And I want to say affiliated with because I'm not sure that's how it was referenced. And if I had to guess, I'm guessing that what they mean is agencies will outsource and contract neuropsychologists. I've had this in organizations I've worked for, where it's not that they work for the organization, but they're contracted out and they provide the service for the agency. So I just think it's interesting, of course. Granted, it's Massachusetts, so we're kind of limited and things are going to overlap, but this was affiliated with McLean Hospital. There are just certain things that happen in the criminal legal system that aren't fate. And these are where my pattern recognition is so good at picking them up. And I can immediately pick it up, but then I need to formulate and get all of the information to make sure that, again, I'm not speculating and I can come up with a theory that is based on the informations and the facts provided. And I'm not saying the theory is absolute, right? It's thought provoking, right? And it's not outlandish, given, as you've seen, the games that are played in court. And for me, it's really disgusting and exhausting. And it's why I don't really watch a lot of these trials, because I know what goes on when we are playing chess and when we're playing games and people are dying, have died, children have died, children are currently dying because of the games that the system plays. This happens so much. People are hurt and harmed and denied care and appropriate care, and they end up hurting themselves and others. And it's very real. It's very real, which this case is highlighting you and showing you how real it is. People detach themselves from these other people when they hear these stories. And I think this is bringing it to the forefront of reality and humanity of know that look at how real this is. Look at the existence of this. This was a real person, and the criminal legal system does a really great job at dehumanizing and detaching themselves from the reality of human beings. And this is something that I've at least argued with and advocated by saying just because people's crisis doesn't exist within the 9 to 5, when people are in crisis and struggling and in the worst moments of their life, every single moment matters. And the system just doesn't care. It doesn't care. So ultimately, the neuropsych and all of the information was put into evidence. And you're supposed to be able to access evidence when it's put into evidence. The judge knew that. But he made a ruling that the only way that the neuropsychologist, when they were on the witness stand and acting as an expert witness, the only way that this doctor could discuss the extent of Latarsha's psychosis was if the Commonwealth mentioned it. Do you think the Commonwealth mentioned it? Of course not, because that would show how psychotic she truly was. Just because, and the argument was that this ultimately these are mental health exams and diagnostics from after the crime, from immediately after the crime. From the moment you pulled up, she was rocking under a blanket, and the crime in itself speaks to a level of psychosis. And then the reported history from families. Just because a person doesn't get the care they need doesn't mean they don't have a problem, doesn't mean their mental health isn't suffering. So the fact that the judge didn't allow it to be discussed unless the Commonwealth mentioned it should absolutely disgust you. And I believe and I know they are doing whatever they can. They're freaking out right now, and they are doing whatever they can to keep Latarsha Sanders' name and case out of the news. to keep this document away from people that can translate it, because talk like normal human beings. Just give it straight up, right? These court documents, I hate reading them myself. It takes me a while to process because I'm like, oh my gosh, stop talking like we're old Englishmen. Holy cow. They're freaking out right now, especially because of Lindsey Clancy's case. So the Commonwealth, of course, did not mention it. Information that was allowed to come forward was that someone said she had an adjustment disorder, Latarsha Sanders, not the psychosis, not the extreme psychosis and extreme reports for over a year from doctors and staff, so on and so forth, adjustment disorder. And now this also gets to me because adjustment disorder, I've worked through a hospital in a clinical setting before. So upon our initial assessment and evaluation that we have to submit, ultimately, because we were dealing with trauma, I worked on the trauma team. Because we were dealing with trauma and trauma isn't recognized in the DSM to the extent of the many different ways that trauma exists, then we had to file and submit a diagnosis of adjustment disorder. Now, having to submit a diagnosis just to fulfill that, why does that happen? Insurance. We can't bill for the service if insurance doesn't recognize it as the disorder. It's just crazy. It's crazy. So in order to bill for the service, I had to put adjustment disorder. So these labels, these disorders follow people who have significant mental health challenges and who aren't being appropriately treated and have inpatient visits, outpatient, all of these different hospitalizations. And with it comes a stigma. And that's another part, that it's not okay to just put a disorder down. But the fact that they allow the adjustment disorder to go through, I would not be surprised. I am speculating based on my own experience. I would not be surprised if the clinician was unsure of how to diagnose Latarsha, and the supervisor and or the organization overall just said put it as adjustment disorder so they can get billed, essentially. So that's the other part that doesn't come up, and that's what I want people to know. So when they're making claims about like adjustment disorder, right, there's another part to it in which, of course, money and insurance comes into play. This happens all the time. So ultimately, I think that either the ADA is so incompetent and made a slip because they are stressed about what's going on with this case, with Lindsey Clancy's case. And now there's another one with similar parallels, same judge, same DA's office, and holy cow. And she's so incompetent that she slipped and said moral sin. And the judge knows that moral is addressed, and specifically that word is in this document in which a new trial was granted, right? Or intentionally hoping for a mistrial. And what happens with a mistrial is the risk of evidence being denied, future evidence being denied, whether the prosecutor doesn't determines or shuts out potential evidence coming in, whether it's the judge coming in. And the evidence that has been presented, they know on Lindsay's behalf has been beneficial for the defense. Reddington knows that. So he's not going to aim for a mistrial. So I would not be surprised because, again, this is how the court operates. It's a giant game. If that is or was a thought. So with all that being said, I want you to really pay attention to closing arguments. I want you to pay attention to the instructions that are allowed by the jury, what the DA is arguing for instructions to be allowed. what Reddington might come back and argue against in regards to what the DA is trying to do. And then following this case, I want us to pay attention to Latarsha Sanders. This is important.